So let's get back to crime scenes. At this point, we've talked about the initial actions at a crime scene. The first responding officer is going to secure that crime scene and make a quick assessment of the scene so that they can locate individuals that potentially might be witnesses and also locate any potential evidence. The documentation has begun with notes, photographs, and a sketch, so now we can begin to discuss our evidence collection. Once the chain of custody log has been created, a search can be conducted to locate and collect any potential evidence. Initially, any evidence that might be lost or contaminated should be first identified and collected. So depending on if it's in a situation where there might be weather involved or traffic involved, whether that be persons or actual vehicles, these are possibilities that might lose evidence or contaminate evidence, and those items should be concentrated on first. In some situations, because of this, specialized persons might be called in to assist in the collection of evidence at a crime scene. So a lot of times, forensic scientists in that crime laboratory might respond to crime scenes to assist police officers in the collection of the evidence. They might also assist in doing some bloodstain spatter interpretations or projectile trajectory examinations also. Initially, the crime scene itself is going to be conducted with some type of a search to more closely identify any potential evidence. That quick assessment may have found some pieces of evidence, but there are going to be also instances where upon a closer look, more evidence may actually be found and able to be collected. So several different types of searches can actually be conducted at that crime scene depending on the crime scene itself. For some outdoor crime scenes where visibility is not real good, a strip or a line type search is going to be one of the best type of searches to identify any evidence that might need to be collected. These are done where you have designated boundaries and you more or less just walk back and forth over the area. There's also grid searches, which are again also good for outdoor searches. Usually this is going to be conducted with 2 or more persons doing line searches, but beginning at adjacent corners. So they're more or less crisscrossing the area and looking for the evidence itself. Spiral searches can be done a lot of times for outdoor searches, but because you are working in more of an outward spiral type action, sometimes it's very hard to keep a perfect circular motion, so some areas could more easily be missed with this type of search. Some individuals may prefer to do a wheel or a ray search where you start at a center point and then work outwards from that. But a lot of individuals will use a zone or a quadrant search where you divide that crime scene into smaller segments and then concentrate specifically in those smaller segments. So if it was an inside crime scene contained within one room of the house, that room itself might be divided into smaller quadrants and then those areas individually searched. No matter what method of search you're using, you're going to want to do that evaluation of the area itself. Make a complete assessment to determine any possible evidence that might be in that scene itself. So usually when you're doing the search with the closer examination, you're going to find several pieces of evidence that might have initially been overlooked through that very quick assessment. In this situation, the quick assessment, the officer may have noticed that there is the table that did have, the cigarette ashtray on it, and he might have been potentially thinking that there is, possibly the cigarette butts in the ashtray. But upon closer look, you'd notice that the cigarette butts, there's several different types of cigarette butts, and then also the possibility of fingerprint examinations on that item. But then also with the closer examination, it might reveal other evidence. So on that closer examination, they might identify the beer can that's slightly hidden underneath that table. So the location and the condition should be established for each piece of evidence that is going to be collected from that crime scene itself. And it should be documented in that chain of custody or in the notes of the officer doing the collection so that it can preserve the chain of custody. There's several different methods that can be used to collect evidence, and a lot of this will be dependent on the evidence itself. There's going to be some types of evidence where picking the samples up with tweezers is going to be the best method of collection. In other types of evidence, taping or scraping items down, shaking items, combing, and in some situations actually vacuuming may be a good form of collection. There's also a wide variety of containers that can be used to actually package the various types of evidence in. And a lot of this we'll be discussing in more specifics when we talk about the various types of evidence that will be examined in a forensics laboratory. With the collection of physical evidence, you also have to consider the collection of elimination or reference samples. So if, for instance, if it's an assault type case, you might also want to take into consideration to get the reference samples from any of the individuals that might have possibly been involved in that assault. So that might be collecting numerous samples from witnesses there at the scene. In addition to collecting control samples from the scene also. If there's the potential that there's fiber transfers, or if you're looking to put a suspect back at a crime scene, there's the possibility that there could be carpet fibers that might have become embedded in the soles of the shoes. So you would want to make sure you take control samples from your scene that you would be able to compare back to any foreign fibers or foreign materials at a later time. During the collection of the evidence, you also want to make sure that everything is adequately labeled. In addition to the items, any unique identifiers, case numbers, descriptions, you also always want to remember to attach any type of warnings or hazards about the evidence inside of the packaging. So if it's something that is bloody, you want to make sure that you attach a biohazard sticker or at least put the wording on the packaging to alert any others that might be handling the evidence of that potential hazard. You also want to make sure that everything that you're collecting is going to be adequately sealed and taped. This is going to prevent items from falling out. It's also going to prevent other things from getting into your container. And the taping is going to provide a measure of security. Usually the evidence tape that is used, it's very easy to tell if it's been disturbed, so it does provide a measure of security. And then putting your initials across that seal is going to be a good way for you to identify it later on in court. All of these facts are then going to be condensed into a comprehensive crime scene report. So this may include a lot of written pages, but then it also may include any sketches, any photographs, and the attachment of any videos that were taken. In this report, the dates, the times, the location, who was present at the scene, basic facts of the scene itself, personnel that arrived or departed, any evidence that was collected and packaged. A lot of these main details would be written in the report itself. A lot of other details, notes, and observations might be contained as part of the notes attached to that final report. When you're at a crime scene, you always have to be aware of safety and contamination issues. So there's a lot of different precautions that can be taken to prevent the loss of evidence and also to provide safety measures to personnel at the crime scene. Being aware of your own actions is the best way to take any precautions. Obviously, refraining from eating, drinking, or smoking while you're at a crime scene will help with the contamination of any evidence. In addition, a lot of times officers will wear masks over their nose and mouth area, sometimes something to contain their hair back so that they can't contaminate scenes with their own hair or cough or sneeze while they're processing a scene. All of these measures are used to help protect the evidence there, but then also to protect the individual that is at the crime scene. You always want to remember to only touch things that are going to actually be necessary. There's always the possibility of trace materials, and because of that, you don't want to touch things unnecessarily. And always keep in mind that there are a lot of materials that might be hazardous to personnel there at the crime scene. There's going to be some items that might be necessary to be collected that might contain diseases. So you need to be aware of this and take measures to protect yourself. A lot of personal protection equipment can be used by the officers responding to scenes to protect themselves from the exposure to potential biohazards. It also helps when you're using this type of personal protection equipment to prevent personnel at the scene from also contaminating evidence. So hair would not be deposited. Wearing gloves isn't going to allow that officer to leave fingerprints or DNA at the scene itself. So using a wide variety of personal protective equipment protects the evidence, and it also protects the officer. A lot of the things listed on this slide are used there at the crime scene, but also in a laboratory setting by the analyst doing examinations on the evidence. So wearing the face shields or masks, wearing gloves, wearing safety goggles, wearing shoe covers. A lot of these personal protective equipments are taken into account at crime scenes and also in the laboratory. You also have to remember if there is the potential that there's biohazards at the crime scene and personnel are going to be handling evidence, even with gloves, that you need to properly dispose of the personal protective equipment. So if you're using gloves and handling things that might have biohazards, make sure as you're changing your gloves that you have a correct method of collecting the used gloves. You always want to leave the evidence where it is until you have the opportunity to collect it, unless there is going to be that chance of loss or destruction to the evidence itself. And those pieces you're going to want to collect as soon as possible. In the collection, you should always use clean gloves with each type of evidence item that you're collecting. In a lot of situations, fibers have static charges to them and are going to be collected on the gloves themselves, and then you could possibly contaminate another item by handling it if you had the same pair of gloves on. So you always want to change your gloves in between each evidence item. Also, if you're using any instruments to collect the evidence, if you're using tweezers or if you're using scissors to cut something out, you want to make sure that you clean those instruments in between each collection. So using a small amount of bleach water on the tweezers or on the scissors would help with avoiding any contamination from the instruments that you're using. So the report itself is going to contain a lot of different information. The date and time, the location, who was present on the arrival, a lot of the facts of the scene itself, who arrived, who departed, and then all of the details of the evidence collection. There's several things that come to play when we talk about evidence collection, and one of the things that evidence can be excluded from a trial is because of Fourth Amendment violations. And usually officers at a crime scene are always going to be aware of whether there is the necessity to actually obtain a warrant before they have the search of that crime scene. And that's what usually they will obtain that warrant so that they have the probable cause that there's been criminal activity that has taken place at that location. There's been a few cases that are well documented that show the need for a warrant being issued. Two of the ones that are, I guess, more prominently known are Mincy versus Arizona, where the police conducted an undercover raid of a suspected drug house. And it ended up that there was an officer and 3 suspects that were shot. The house, the drug house itself, was searched extensively over a 4-day period. However, they had not obtained a warrant when they were doing the searches, and because of this, that conviction was overturned. The second case is Michigan versus Tyler, and this involved a fire at a furniture store. And the investigators conducted searches well after the fire was out. But once again, these convictions were overturned because there was not that initial emergency search situation. The officers would have been able to obtain a search warrant before they did their examination of the scene. and they should have obtained that. In most situations, it is necessary to obtain a search warrant. However, there are some exceptions to this rule also. There are, under some circumstances, exceptions where a warrant isn't necessary. And these are a few of those situations where you have border searches, where the customs are allowed to search individuals at the border. This does not require a warrant. If a person consents to a search, there is not the need to obtain a warrant. Likewise, if an individual is going to be arrested, they can also be searched without obtaining a warrant. And also, if an item is in plain view, that officer does not have to obtain a search warrant. Other exceptions are when there's emergency situations. So if they have reasonable suspicion that an injured person is inside, they can enter that house without a search warrant. Open fields, there should be no expectation of privacy, so a warrant would not be necessary. If an officer stops and frisks somebody, you can frisk somebody under suspicious situations to determine whether or not they're armed or dangerous. So this would not involve obtaining a warrant. And also vehicle inventories. When a driver has been stopped or another occupant is in the process of being arrested, they can go ahead and search that vehicle legally. When time and circumstances permit, warrants should always be obtained, but there are those few instances where there is not the necessity of getting a warrant. So usually these are going to be your emergency type situations, or where the loss of evidence or the destruction of evidence could possibly occur if there is that time lapse while that officer is getting the warrant. The search of persons or property while in the process of being arrested, there is no warrant necessary. And also, if a person gives a consent for that search, there isn't the necessity of a search warrant. This finishes our discussion on crime scenes, and our next discussion will be about physical evidence itself.